Percy Jackson is about to be kicked out of boarding school again, and that's the least of his troubles. Lately, mythological monsters and the gods of Mount Olympus seem to be walking straight out of the pages of Percy's Greek mythology textbook and into his life. And worse, he's angered a few of them. Zeus's master lightning bolt has been stolen, and Percy is the prime suspect. Now Percy and his friends have just 10 days to find and return Zeus's stolen property and bring peace to a warring Mount Olympus. But to succeed on his quest, Percy will have to do more than catch the true thief. He must come to terms with the father who abandoned him, solve the riddle of the oracle, which warns him of a betrayal by a friend, and unravel a treachery more powerful than the gods themselves. So the way I handle this review, and the way I'll be handling the reviews for the next Percy Jackson books, is that for each chapter, I wrote some quick anecdotes that I found interesting, or was needed to be pointed out. Or sometimes, it's just the little details that were interesting to me. I've tried writing a book review video in the past, and the information I retained just seems so incomplete to me. So to avoid that, this is the style I chose. Let me know what you think of it after the video. Also, I explicitly didn't want to summarize the story. There are a ton of videos on YouTube that do that already, so this is just my version of what a book review should be. If you want me to make a summary video of this particular book, let me know in the comments. There will be spoilers because that's just how I wrote my anecdotes. So if you don't want to be spoiled, pause the video and read the book, and then come back so that we can be on the same page on this one. With all that being said, here's my review of Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. Chapter 1. I accidentally vaporized my pre-algebra teacher. The first chapter of this book really kicks off with a nice introduction from our main protagonist, Percy. He's the narrator of this story, and we get to learn about this world through his eyes, his point of view. He's a troubled kid, or more accurately, a kid who gets into a lot of trouble. And this chapter presents us with a cool but quick fight scene between Percy and one of his strange elementary teachers, who turns out to be more than meets the eye. I know that's a Transformers reference, which has nothing to do with this series, but it fits the metaphor. So, I liked how slow and subtle Greek mythology was introduced to us throughout this first chapter. We get to learn about it through Percy, who has a lot of knowledge around it because it's the only subject he has an interest on. We aren't spoon-fed with information that makes it hard for us to digest the story. We're served the right amount of it, and I think that's really cool to see. Chapter 2. 3 old ladies knit the socks of death. The second chapter starts as a reaction scene for the first chapter. You have Percy figuring out the strange reality he's in with all the conspiracy happening regarding Mrs. Dodds, or I guess the lack of a Mrs. Dodds in their school. He discovers a few things about Grover and Mr. Brunner, and again, we get a sprinkle of setup for things to come, like the subtle hint of Mr. Brunner not being what he actually seems, and Grover playing a secret role in his friendship with Percy. We are somewhat introduced to the Stygian witches, taking the form of 3 old ladies knitting a giant sock in the middle of a country road. Percy doesn't interact with them, but he gets to see one of the Grey Sisters cut a piece of thread right in front of him. What this means, I guess we'll figure it out at a later time. Chapter 3. Grover unexpectedly loses his pants. The name of this chapter is kind of weird because a large chunk of it was focused on showing us Percy's mother, Sally, and his smelly stepfather named Gabe. Sally Jackson, in Percy's eyes, feels like such a kind, warm, and wonderful person. I can really feel his love for his mom, because out of all of the things he has to put up with his troublesome life, his mom acts as a sort of shining light or rainbow at the end of a heavy storm. Gabe, on the other hand, is such an unlikable character, and that's by design. Percy tells us that Gabe smells so awful that his stench gets caught in almost everything he touches. It's definitely a mystery how Sally puts up with this joke of a man. Definitely a mystery. Like I said, the name of this chapter is weird because Grover only appears at the very end of it, and it ends on a cliffhanger that'll make you want to read more, and it definitely works. Chapter 4. My mother teaches me bullfighting. This chapter was simply amazing. Percy's mother vanishes before her eyes, but he does get to fight a minotaur and live to tell the tale, so it all evens out, I guess. Whenever I read an action scene of some kind, I tend to read faster. Does that happen to you too? I think it's generally because of the fast-paced energy these particular scenes feel that you naturally end up reading twice as fast as you would with normal mundane scenes. And I guess with slower scenes, you also tend to read a little bit slower. Take time to let the moment breathe and whatnot. Chapter 5. I Play Pinnacle with a Horse. The 5th chapter had a lot of info dump, and I guess that was appropriate, seeing that Percy is now finally inside of Camp Half-Blood. He's introduced to Mr. D, which I honestly just really enjoy reading about for some reason, and Annabeth, who is said to be one of the oldest campers living there. Percy interacts with her only briefly, and the rest of the chapter revolves around a card game with Mr. D, Grover, and Mr. Brunner, who is really a centaur named Chiron. Oh, and Mr. D is actually Dionysus, the Greek god of wine. He's just there as punishment, which is really funny. You know what I noticed when I was rereading this chapter? In their first interaction, Mr. D calls Percy by his full name, and I remember specifically that Mr. D is known to get Percy's name wrong throughout the series. He intentionally calls him by a different name just to mess with him or whatever. It's interesting to see that in their very first interaction, Mr. D knows his name and uses it throughout the rest of the conversation. Chapter 6. I Become Supreme Lord of the Bathroom. Chapter 6 is another great chapter. I almost said episode. Don't you think each chapter of this book kind of feels like it could be an episode? There are 22 chapters in this book, and that's honestly how long a season of a show usually is. If only that's how they did it, and did it as an animation. Anyway, this chapter rocks. We get a nice scene of Chiron showing Percy around Camp Half-Blood. There were a lot of Easter eggs here, especially with the mention of a girl tending to the campfire in the middle of the 12 cabins. Chiron passes the tour on to Annabeth, and we get introduced to Luke and Clarice. Clarice is your typical bully, but I still like her. It's actually really interesting seeing that very early on in this series, most of the conflict Percy faces are from female characters. Mrs. Dodds is the first monster Percy encounters, and she's shown to be a strict and sturdy individual. Percy's school bully is Nancy Bobofet, which is cool to see. Typically in high school or elementary, especially from my experience, bullies tended to be a group of guys. Sally Jackson is also kind of a conflict for Percy, but more in like an emotional way. We get to hear his internal monologue of how he loves his mother so much that the loss of her keeps him from fully enjoying his time in Camp Half-Blood. Annabeth is a subversion of the kind of girl she looks like. It was written in chapter 5 that she has curly blonde hair, athletic looking, and is just your stereotypical California girl. But her actions and the subtle nuances to her are what make her the complete opposite. She takes time choosing her words. Her eyes look like she's analyzing every passing moment, and she doesn't help Percy when he's faced with Clarice. She intentionally allows for it to happen so that she could see what this new kid is capable of, and I find that really cool. Chapter 7. My Dinner Goes Up in Smoke. This chapter was a cozy one to read. This is honestly why I love this series. The fight scenes and action sequences are cool and all, but these quieter moments of everyday life for the demigods are what I always come back for. Annabeth teaches Percy more things about the camp, maintaining that consistent attitude of being annoyed and intrigued at the same time, while also probably thinking of a million things at the back of her head. I forgot to mention it from chapter 6, but Annabeth explains everything bad about Percy Jackson and turns it into something good. The things he finds to be his weakness are actually his greatest strengths, and that goes for all of the kids in the camp, including Annabeth. Percy gets to interact with Luke more in chapter 7, and I noticed that Luke's not really written as a bad guy pretending to be good. I remember reading this back then, having the image of the guy who played Luke Castellan in the movie adaptation, while reading Luke's parts in the book. With that perspective, I always disliked Luke's character, which was clearly unwarranted. Luke seems to be a nice guy, like genuinely a nice guy. It's just that there's a lot going on in his mind as well that makes him a complicated character in a lot of ways. And that's totally valid. Chapter 8. We Capture a Flag. Chapter 8 is such a good chapter, man. It starts with a montage of Percy's second day at Camp Half-Blood, and immediately continues with Capture the Flag. I don't say this enough, but Annabeth is written incredibly well in this story. She doesn't get that much screen time in terms of Percy's narrations, but when she does appear in the scene, she steals every moment that she's in. And she's not even doing that much, honestly. It's those small details that complement her being a daughter of Athena that really makes you want to see more of her in the story. One thing I do want to note, and this is me looking at this series as a whole, is that Luke is a foil to Percy's character. He's much like Percy, but with more experience and the same kind of backstory or motive. He's mentioned being mad at the gods for not being there most of the time, and that reflects Percy's growing dislike for how his father has been treating him throughout his life, or the lack of a better treatment from his own father. So I believe that's what makes Luke a compelling antagonist later in the story, because he and Percy are not much different in a lot of ways. But I'm getting ahead of myself too much here already. Chapter 9. I am offered a quest. This chapter was heavy with plot, is all I can say. It's overwhelming for Percy, and for me, the reader. The dream sequences in this series are always interesting to read. They don't make sense, which is valid, but you also have to really sink your head into these scenes to figure out what's happening at the same time as Percy does. It's always a nice little treat, I would say. Mr. D calls Percy by his full name correctly again, and that makes me wonder if he really cares for Percy, but just in private conversations, and not in a large crowd. Before the Capture the Flag sequence in the last chapter, Mr. D calls Percy by a different name, and he's saying it in front of a crowd. So maybe he does intentionally say the wrong name to keep the facade that he doesn't care much for half-bloods. But that's just my theory. Also, Percy at this point had a strong feeling that Annabeth was listening in on his whole conversation with Chiron and the others. He wasn't fazed by her sudden appearance at the end of the chapter, which really just shows that he's gotten more attentive of her. And much like Annabeth, he too is starting to anticipate her every move, her every pattern. That's what you call the start of a crush. Chapter 10. I Ruin a Perfectly Good Bus. Just another great action-filled chapter between Percy and his friends against the Fury sisters. But before all that, Percy, Annabeth, and Grover say their temporary goodbyes to Chiron. Luke gives the winged shoes to Percy, and Argus drives them to a bus station. There's an interesting monologue here where Percy is kind of angry at his dad for not giving him anything that's remotely considered Greek-made. Riptide is an exception, but here we get to hear more of the growing dislike Percy is realizing that he has towards his father, and towards other gods in general. Chapter 11. We visit the Garden Gnome Emporium. Oh, Medusa, they never treat you right, do they? She's honestly a tragic character, in my opinion. Sure, she's turning people to stone, but that comes with her predicament, you know. I like how in every new monster or character that Percy and his friends face, they get to learn a little Greek mythology backstory from them. But I guess that's the whole point of this book series, so I'm basically pointing out the obvious. But still, that's what I really appreciate about these books. Greek mythology is such an interesting topic. Percy and Annabeth's bickering dynamic is shown a lot in this chapter, and that's just the start of their relationship. The more you hate, the more you love. Chapter 12. We get advice from a poodle. This chapter kind of felt off to me. I like that we got to learn more about Grover's purpose as a character, giving him more dimensions and telling us that outside of being a protector, he's got his own quest going on in the background. But I kind of felt like the timing of the conversation was so sudden. It was abrupt, but then again, I don't know when else his lore could have been told at the right time. Maybe if he had told it sooner, like while they were in camp or something. I don't know. I just felt like the information was forced to be shared in that moment. The dream sequence for this chapter was cool. It always is. I can see how Percy would think that it's Hades calling out to him, haunting him in his dreams. The vibe is definitely similar. And Gladiola, the poodle, I feel like she was just added to move the plot a little faster. Her presence at the end was just so convenient for Percy's situation, that's all. But then again, it does help us learn that Grover can talk to animals since he himself is part animal. But other than that, it feels kind of lazy. Chapter 13, I Plunged to My Death. Another great chapter. We get to learn more about Annabeth, specifically about her relationship with her dad, her aspirations of becoming an architect one day, and her fondness for historic monuments. What follows next is Percy fighting against Echidna and her son, the Chimera, another formidable opponent. And it's all been women so far in this story. That's interesting. I never noticed that back then. But then again, when we're kids, we don't really pay attention to these kinds of things. Chapter 14, I Become a Known Fugitive. This is the quickest chapter so far, but we did get to read about a particular water nymph that Percy initially thinks is his mother, but isn't, and is never mentioned by name. I searched the web for who it could be, but I didn't get any concrete answer. I even asked ChatGPT if it knew anything, and the answer was that it was just one of Poseidon's water nymphs. Chapter 15, A God Buys Us Cheeseburgers. Percy talks to Luke via an iris message, and he really is just looking out for his friends. He means them no harm, which makes his betrayal in the end have more impact. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. We get to meet Ares, which is the very first significantly important male character that they encounter since the start of their quest. It's even funnier that, of all people, it would be Ares. He's the embodiment of masculinity and testosterone, you know? That's just so funny to think about. They go to Hephaestus' scene part to get Ares' shield. And my only takeaway from that is now we know that Annabeth is afraid of spiders. Great action sequence though. Would have loved seeing that done well in the adaptation, but... Chapter 16, We Take a Zebra to Vegas. This chapter was the longest one so far, or at least it felt like the longest one to read. And that's actually quite fitting given that the last part of this chapter was when Percy and his friends arrived at the Lotus Hotel. The way it's narrated is even designed in a way that makes you forget the main plot for a moment, until Percy notices all of the weird details from the people who were inside of the hotel with him. Before all that, we finally get a full scope of Grover and Annabeth's backstory, as well as find out that Percy can talk to zebras, which are basically striped horses, an ability he inherited from his father, probably. Ares gives Percy a bag. Now on to the next chapter. Chapter 17, We Shop for Waterbeds. Turns out that the water spirit from chapter 14 was the Nereid, another one of Poseidon's loyal servants. She gives Percy 3 pearls which he can use on his quest to the underworld. In this chapter, Percy comes across Procrustes, which is a name I wasn't familiar with. With a little bit of research, I found out that Procrustes, or Krusty, as he liked to be called in this book, is the son of Poseidon, which means that Percy and Krusty are cousins. Talk about family issues, am I right? Chapter 18, Annabeth Does Obedience School. This chapter was really fun and interesting. They meet Karen, who instantly became one of my favorite characters to read in this story. He has such a cool personality. He seems like a chill guy, to be honest. He's like one of those 9-to-5 employees who doesn't get paid well enough. So he's just like, whatever man. He does respect the rules though, but also, if you give him enough persuasion, he might just give you some slack. I like that about him. Annabeth befriends Cerberus by playing fetch with him and doing some quick dog whisperer magic on him that she learned from one of her bonding moments with her dad. That's all you really need in this world. She's so pure sometimes. I can't get enough of her. Chapter 19, We Find Out the Truth, sort of. A lot of stuff happened in this chapter. Percy and his friends are in the depths of the underworld. They meet Hades and have this long discussion that leads to them escaping via the pearls that the Nereid gave Percy. Hades is written really well. I kept shifting from Loki sitting on the throne at the end of Loki season 2 to Professor Snape because of how he's described to have long hair and a dark cloak around him. The voice, I imagine, would be like the deep, raspy voice of the voice actor for the Hades video game, but with a mixture of Loki and Professor Snape combined. His presence in this chapter was definitely a powerful one. Godly, some would say. Oh, and yeah, the Master Bolt was inside of the backpack Ares gave to Percy. Chapter 20, I Battle My Jerk Relative. The final battle of this book happens in this chapter. Percy Jackson versus the God of War himself. Kratos. Sorry, Ares put the Master Bolt inside of the backpack and had Hades' Helm of Darkness. But he wasn't the one behind all of this. Like he said, he couldn't interfere directly, but a demigod could. And a demigod did. It's just a matter of which demigod it was. Somebody much more powerful is behind all of the trouble Percy has been dealing with throughout this story. And it has something to do with the voice coming from the pit of Tartarus. Or it is the voice from the pit that's ordering Ares around this whole time. Percy wins the fight against the god of war, and he returns the helm to the Furies. Mrs. Dodds commends Percy a little bit, since she realized that Percy was never really the lightning thief to begin with. Now, all that's left for them to do is to take an elevator to the 600th floor of the Empire State Building. Chapter 21. I Settled My Tab. You know what I like about this chapter? It's not that Percy finally meets his father, Poseidon, or that he proves himself innocent by returning the Master Bolt to Zeus, or that it's revealed that it was Kronos haunting him in his dreams and was behind all of it at the very beginning. Before all that, Percy tries to speak to the guy at the front desk of the Empire State Building. He describes the book he's holding having a wizard at the front cover, which could only mean two possibilities. The guy was either reading a Harry Potter book or Lord of the Rings, and it was probably Lord of the Rings because Percy also describes it as a huge book. The Lightning Thief was published in July 1, 2005, and the 6th Harry Potter book, the one with Dumbledore on the cover, was released in July 16 of that same year. So the timeline doesn't fit unless Rick Riordan saw an early release of Half-Blood Prince and gave a nod to it on his book. So it's probably Lord of the Rings. Chapter 22. The Prophecy Comes True. The final chapter sees Percy hearing the truth unfold as Luke reveals everything to him. He was the one who took the Master Bolt and the Helm of Darkness, but Ares caught him and stole it from him afterwards. Kronos had been talking to him in his dreams and has been poisoning him of the wrong ideologies. And it circles back to what I mentioned in the earlier chapters. Luke is angry with the gods for mistreating him, and Percy was kind of at that same headspace all throughout his quest. What I didn't really like about this chapter was that somehow it felt like Luke's personality did a complete 180 flip from being this friendly, brotherly person towards Percy to an absolute villain of a character. I mean, I get it. It's the final chapter, so the final twist had to be revealed. But Luke turning on Percy and poisoning him with a scorpion just seemed like an illogical step for me. Luke was written throughout the book as this brotherly figure who literally helped train Percy to wield a sword and get better with fighting. He seemed like a guy who cared about his fellow half-bloods, which would make sense even with his ulterior motives, because his fight isn't with the demigods, it's with the gods. So Luke should have been trying to recruit Percy to side with him, even at the very end. He knows Percy has gone through the same problems with his parents, and so logically, he should have still tried his damnedest to make Percy see reason. That to me would have made him a much more compelling antagonist moving forward. But with this kind of execution, it turned Luke into a very half-baked plot twist villain. Anyway, Annabeth decides to go home for the rest of the year, and Percy decides to do the same at the end of this chapter. This was definitely a great introduction to the world of Percy Jackson. It was very easy to read, but then again, this was a middle grade level book, and I'm 26 years old already. But that didn't really stop me from loving this book. I love all of the Greek mythology characters that were showcased in this book. It's jam-packed, but also enough that it didn't feel so bombarded. The only real weakness this book has was with how the ending was handled. I get that it was the final chapter, and there had to be no loose ends. But still, I would have loved to see Luke try to convince Percy that his actions were justified. Not saying they were, but I mean, no person sees themselves as the villain. In a lot of ways, Luke literally sees himself as the hero of his story, and we all do in our own lives. Other than that one key complaint, I really enjoyed reading this book again. This is probably my third or fourth time reading this book. I finished it in 4 days, which isn't really something to be proud of. But hey, if you got to the very end of this book review, then you should probably give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Make sure to hit the bell to get notified for when another book review video comes out. I'll be reviewing the entire Percy Jackson books up until The Last Olympian. I don't have the Heroes of Olympus books yet. That's all I have to say. This is Elmo's Universe, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.